The pounding on the door was not a knock. It was an aggressive, percussive demand that shook the frame. "Open up. This is the HOA police." Inside his sunlit kitchen, Marcus Dean lowered the morning's intelligence briefing. His expression won a mild, analytical curiosity. The voice was all bluster and borrowed authority, the kind that tried to mask insecurity with volume. He wasn't expecting anyone. And HOA police? The term was so ludicrous, it was almost charming. He took a final, slow sip of his black coffee, the calm at the center of the impending storm. Through the peephole of his quiet suburban home in Atlanta, the scene was both absurd and menacing. 3 men stood on his pristine porch, stuffed into cheap navy blue uniforms that were a poor imitation of a real police force. Their badges, which they flashed with theatrical urgency, were plastic and gaudy. They had the puffed-up posture of mall cops who'd been given a single ounce of power and had let it ferment into pure arrogance. Marcus, a black man in his mid-40s wearing simple sweatpants and a plain t-shirt, felt a familiar calm settle over him. This was a different kind of threat assessment, a domestic one. But the principles were the same. Identify, analyze, control. He unlocked and opened the door just enough to frame himself in space, his body language neutral but blocking entry. The lead officer, a man with a florid face and a clipboard he wielded like a weapon, didn't even make eye contact. His gaze was already scanning over Marcus's shoulder, hunting for violations. "We've received multiple complaints," the man barked, his voice tinny with self-importance. "Your lawn is 3/16 of an inch beyond regulation height, and we have numerous reports of unauthorized and suspicious visitors at all hours." The subtext was as clear as it was ugly. The visitors were his college-age nephew who drove a beat-up Honda, and his partner, Agent Carter, a white man with a penchant for loud motorcycles, who had dropped off case files the night before. The infractions were a flimsy pretext. This was about intimidation. This was about who they thought he was. Just a man in a t-shirt, an easy target in his own home. A cold, sharp smile touched Marcus's lips. It was a smile his colleagues at the FBI knew to fear. It didn't reach his eyes, which had gone flat and hard, shifting from the warm brown of a homeowner to the obsidian gaze of a federal agent. "I see," Marcus said, his voice dangerously quiet, a stark contrast to their shouting. "You're here on official HOA business, you say? May I see your credentials?" "All of them, and your articles of incorporation that grant you the authority to form a private police force and harass citizens on their private property." The men blinked. The script was not being followed. They fumbled with their fake badges. The leader stammered, "We don't have to show you." "You do, actually," Marcus interrupted, his tone shifting to one of cold, professional steel. "Because while you're playing cop, I enforce actual federal law. The impersonation of a police officer is a felony in the state of Georgia. Harassment based on racial bias is a federal civil rights violation. And trespassing on my property while doing so? That's just stupid." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Every word was a precise, hammered nail in the coffin of their confidence. The color drained from the leader's face as he finally, truly looked at the man before him. He saw the coiled stillness, the absolute authority, the terrifying lack of fear. "My name is Special Agent Marcus Dean, Federal Bureau of Investigation," he stated, each syllable a brick wall. "Now, gentlemen, the question is no longer about my grass. It's about which one of you would like to explain your actions to my colleagues downtown first." The silence on the porch was deafening. The clipboard hung limply at the man's side. Their biggest mistake wasn't picking the wrong house. It was failing to see the predator behind a quiet door. The lead officer, a man with a bulldog's jowls and a too-tight collar, puffed out his chest. "We're placing you under citizen's arrest for repeated and willful violation of Covenant 7B, subsection 4, regarding lawn maintenance, and Covenant 12A, regarding unauthorized and disruptive guests. You need to come with us." His 2 lackeys shifted their weight, trying to look imposing. They didn't understand that the man in the doorway was a human scanner, and they were failing every diagnostic. Marcus's eyes, trained to assess threats in microseconds, cataloged the details. The cheap airsoft-grade pistols shoved into their belts without holsters, a flagrant safety violation. the subtly mismatched shades of their polyblend uniforms, the scuffed, non-regulation boots, the badges that had the cheap, pixelated sheen of an inkjet printer on plastic. This wasn't a sanctioned action. This was a poorly funded, reckless charade. Yet, there was an unnerving confidence to their harassment. This wasn't just about grass. The mention of suspicious activities was a deliberate dog whistle, a thin veil over the real motive. They weren't here for a fine. They were here to intimidate, to remove him. Years of negotiating with hostage takers and infiltrating syndicates had taught Marcus that the first one to speak often loses. He let their ridiculous pronouncement hang in the humid Atlanta air, his silence becoming a weapon that unnerved them more than any shout could. He watched their eyes dart, their false bravado beginning to crack under the weight of his unnerving calm. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low, measured rumble that demanded attention. It wasn't the question they expected. It wasn't about warrants or lawyers or HOA bylaws. Who sent you? The three men exchanged glances, thrown off script. The leader recovered with a forced, nasal laugh. The community sent us. The concerned homeowners. Now, don't worry about that. Just come along quietly, and we can make all this unpleasantness go away. The phrase was a classic manipulation tactic, one he'd heard from corrupt officials and two-bit criminals from D.C. to Kiev. Make it go away. It was a language of extra-legal coercion. What they couldn't see was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift of Marcus's right wrist as he adjusted his watch. A double tap of the crown, a faint, silent vibration against the skin confirmed the activation. The sophisticated device, far from a mere timepiece, was a direct line to the FBI's Atlanta field office. It transmitted a silent duress signal, his GPS coordinates, and had now begun streaming high-fidelity audio the entire encounter to a monitoring station. Backup was already being dispatched, and every foolish word was being etched onto a federal server. A cold, predatory smile touched Marcus's lips. Fear was not an emotion he felt. Instead, a sharp, professional curiosity took hold. These weren't just overzealous busybodies. They were pawns. The sloppiness of their operation suggested desperation or stupidity, but the targeted nature of it, the specific mention of his visitors, hinted at something else. Someone had pointed them at him. Someone who knew the HOA was a convenient weapon, but lacked the courage to wield it themselves. Someone who wanted Agent Marcus Dean out of his home, and perhaps out of the picture entirely. The game had suddenly changed. They thought they were apprehending a nuisance homeowner. They had, in fact, walked blindly into an active investigation, with a federal agent as the sole subject. And Marcus, the lead imposter's patience, a thin veneer over his arrogance, finally shattered. Enough of this, he grunted, nodding to the bulliest of his companions. Bring him in for processing. The man, all thick neck and cheap bravado, stepped across the threshold, his meaty hand reaching out to clamp onto Marcus's arm. It was the spark that ignited the fuse. The violation of his home, the laying of hands on a federal agent. It transformed the situation from a bizarre intimidation attempt into a clear and present criminal act. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't jerk away. Instead, he moved with a terrifying, liquid grace. As the man's fingers brushed his sleeve, Marcus simply stood, a slow, deliberate uncoiling of power that made the larger man instinctively take a half step back. The calm, analytical gaze was gone, replaced by an aura of absolute, unassailable authority that seemed to suck the air from the porch. He reached into the pocket of his sweatpants. The three men tensed, hands twitching toward their fake pistols, expecting a weapon. What he produced was a slim black leather wallet. He didn't flash it. He performed a slow, deliberate ritual of revelation. He flipped it open and placed it on the small entryway table beside the door, positioning it so the gold emblem caught the morning light. Federal Bureau of Investigation, he said, his voice no longer quiet but flat, hard, and resonant with the full weight of the institution he represented. Special Agent Marcus Dean. And you three are no longer conducting an arrest. You are the subjects of one. The color drained from their faces as if a plug had been pulled. Their bluster evaporated into the humid air, replaced by a stark, dawning horror. The leader's mouth opened and closed, soundlessly, a fish gasping on a dock. The one who had reached for Marcus looked down at his own hand, as if it had betrayed him. "Let's inventory your felony, shall we?" Marcus continued, his tone clinical, like a surgeon listing instruments. "You presented yourselves as law enforcement with fake badges and uniforms. That's Title 18, Section 912, Federal Impersonation. You conspire to do so, conspiracy. You cross a state threshold to commit this act. You attempted to seize me against my will. That moves us into attempted kidnapping territory. And those illegal firearms you're poorly concealing? That's just a garnish on this entire shit show." The leader found his voice, a thin, reedy thing that cracked on the first syllable. You can't scare us. This is a misunderstanding. We're with the HOA. The HOA doesn't have a police force. Marcus cut in, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was far more frightening than any shout. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the leaders, allowing the man to see the cold, relentless hunter within. "But you knew that, didn't you? Which means someone told you to do this. Someone who thought this would scare me away. Someone who is now your only conceivable hope for a plea deal." He paused, letting the implication hang in the silence, a ticking clock over their heads. "You should be very worried about who sent you," Marcus whispered, the words cold and precise. "Because finding them uncovering the coward who thought he could use you three fools to intimidate an FBI agent in his own home. That is now my primary concern. And you are going to help me." The wail of sirens wasn't a distant promise. It was a converging wall of sound that descended upon the quiet suburban street within minutes. Neighbors peered through blinds, their morning routines shattered by the sight of black SUVs and marked patrol cars, screeching to a halt. The response to Marcus's silent alarm was swift and overwhelming. Real FBI agents, their jackets emblazoned with the letters that truly meant something, swarmed the property. Their professionalism was a stark contrast to the pathetic pantomime that had just unfolded. With cold, efficient precision, the three imposters were disarmed, their cheap pistols bagged as evidence. The plastic badges were treated with more care than they deserved, placed into evidence bags that highlighted their shoddy construction. The men were read their rights, their earlier bravado replaced by a trembling, ashen-faced silence as cold steel handcuffs were clasped around their wrists. They were led away and deposited into the back of squad cars, their world having shrunk from would-be enforcers to common criminals in the span of a coffee cup. But for Marcus, now standing on his porch in a crisp FBI windbreaker someone had handed him, this was merely the prelude. The arrest was the end point of their story, but it was the beginning of his. The interrogation didn't happen at a distant precinct. It began in his own living room, a psychological masterstroke. Separated and terrified, the men's resolve crumbled like dust. They weren't hardened criminals. They were desperate fools, and they sang. The story they told was more shocking than Marcus had anticipated. They weren't just overzealous HOA volunteers on a power trip. They were hired muscle, paid in untraceable cash delivered in a plain envelope. Their instructions were specific. Target Agent Dean, use the HOA rules as a pretext, and physically remove him from his home. The goal was to make it look like a neighborhood dispute, a passionate argument that had escalated tragically, a homeowner resisting a fake citizen's arrest. A quiet, local tragedy that would never make federal headlines. The moment they mentioned the anonymous payment and the specific instruction to remove him, the pieces snapped into place with terrifying clarity. This wasn't random harassment. This was an assassination attempt disguised as suburban drama. Marcus's mind raced, connecting the dots to his current caseload. He had been deep undercover, unraveling a sophisticated money laundering operation that funneled illicit cash through a network of shell companies and, crucially, overvalued real estate developments. At the heart of it was a corrupt, powerful developer named Roland Vancorp, a man who controlled numerous homeowners associations, using them as instrument of control to maintain property values and silence dissent within his empire. The HOA police were Vancorp's brainchild, a cheap, deniable tool. Who would question a few overenthusiastic HOA members? It was the perfect cover. Vancorp had discovered Marcus's identity, and his investigation was getting too close. Instead of hiring professional killers who would leave a federal trail, he had used the resources he already controlled. His own private militia fools. A grim smile touched Marcus's lips as he watched the last squad car pull away. Vancorp had tried to use a man's own environment against him, to make his disappearance look like a mundane suburban incident. But in his arrogance, the developer had made a catastrophic error. He hadn't just tried to silence an FBI agent. He had attacked him in his home, on his doorstep. He had personally made it a vendetta. The pawns had been swept from the board. Now, Marcus Dean turned his gaze to the player who had moved them. The hunter was coming for the head of the snake, and he had just been handed all the motivation he needed. The investigation that followed was a masterclass in federal dismantling. The three would-be kidnappers, facing decades in prison, became the most cooperative witnesses in the history of the Atlanta field office. Their testimony provided the first thread, and Marcus Dean, with the cold focus of a surgeon, began to pull. That thread led directly to Roland Vancorp's sprawling empire corruption. The HOA police were just the tip of the spear. Marcus's team uncovered that Vancorp used multiple homeowners associations as legalized extortion rackets, strong-arming homeowners, funneling HOA fees into his shell companies, and laundering money through inflated contract for landscaping and security, contract awarded to his own firms. The fake officers were merely the enforcement arm of a scheme that bled entire neighborhoods dry under the guise of community standards. The confessions cracked the case wide open. Warrants were executed on Vancorp's offices, revealing a web of fraud that ensnared not just a developer, but also a city councilman, several bank officials, and a surprisingly long list of corrupt property managers. The HOA, a symbol of suburban order, had been perverted into a weapon, and Marcus had exposed it all. The quiet street in Atlanta was never the same. Neighbors who had once gossiped about Marcus's suspicious lawn, or visitors now gathered in hushed, stunned groups, watching the news vans apart. The man they'd barely acknowledged was a legend in their midst. The HOA police hadn't just picked the wrong house. They had walked blindly into a trap set by their intended prey, a predator far more dangerous than they could ever imagine. And Marcus? He never gave a press conference. He never sought fame or credit. Once the media circus packed up, he was simply the quiet man down the street again, though now his calm demeanor carried the weight of proven power. To those who asked, he offered a simple, powerful truth that became something of a local legend. Never judge someone by the height of their grass or the simplicity of their t-shirt. And never, ever underestimate the quiet man who knows exactly who you are, even before you knock on his door. The tale of the fake HOA police spread like wildfire online, evolving from a news story into a modern parable. It was shared in HOA complaint forums, community watch groups, and law enforcement circles alike. It became a symbol of poetic justice, a reminder that arrogance and a cheap uniform are no match for calm competence and the unwavering rule of law. It underscored a terrifying truth, that criminals can wear fake badges, knock on your door, and hide behind a veneer of authority, but the real thing always wins in the end. Because on that day, the hunters had indeed become the hunted. They had sought to remove a nuisance and instead triggered their own annihilation. They learned the hard way why Agent Marcus Dean was the most feared man in the Bureau. Not because he shouted, but because he listened. Not because he reacted, but because he calculated. And he always held the high ground, even when standing in his own doorway in a pair of sweatpants.